Sometimes I wonder if everything would have turned out differently if Dad hadn't died that spring morning, when the sun was just beginning to peek through the curtains and the smell of fried dough and sweet syrup filled the house. I was 6, and I remember every detail of that morning as if it were relived somewhere inside me, not even in memory, but in the very fabric of my breath. Dad, as always, stood at the stove in his old gray t-shirt, stained with flour and batter spatters, making his Sunday pancakes from the special menu. That's what he called it, as if he were the head chef at some magical restaurant where smiles were the main ingredient. He loved to cut funny faces out of the pancakes, heart-shaped eyes, or a crooked smile that made me laugh until my stomach hurt. Mom was setting plates on the table, humming a soft tune, her voice softly filling the kitchen like the scent of vanilla and coffee. I don't remember the song itself anymore, only that feeling of warmth, as if the entire world had been compressed into our kitchen and nothing bad could happen. Brittany, princess, come help, your old man has knocked over those masterpieces. Dad called, waving his spatula like a magic wand, and I rushed to him, leaving my old stuffed rabbit with a torn ear on the sofa. Like me, it had always seemed like only good things lay ahead. But everything ended in a second. The spatula fell to the floor with a dull thud, and it took me a moment to understand why Dad wasn't laughing, why he wasn't joking, why his eyes suddenly took on a strange, alien look. He clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain, and time seemed to stand still. Then everything became a blur. The screams, Mom's hands, the smell of medicine, the ambulance sirens, the cold hospital corridors, and Mom crying, her face buried in my hair, as if it could hide her from this nightmare. Dad left, leaving behind a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. I stopped laughing, stopped asking for pancakes on Sundays. Mom didn't cry for long, or maybe she just learned to do it somewhere inside, without tears. And then Richard appeared. She met him at a support group for widowed parents. He was tall, with a soft voice and eyes that gleamed with kindness, not the kind that comes from ease, but the kind born of loss. He smiled in a way that reminded me of Dad for a second, and it made my chest tighten. A year later, they married, and he moved in with us, bringing the scent of aftershave and a tart patience into the house. I tried to get used to him, tried to believe that we were a family again, but Mom suddenly, as if on purpose, added a new sensation to our lives. She was pregnant. I remember how she beamed when she told me I was going to be a big sister, and I smiled because I needed to. But somewhere inside me, a quiet fear simmered, as if someone would be replacing me again. When Tommy was born, I was 8, and with his first cry, something subtly changed. Mom quit school, telling everyone that those early years were crucial, that Tommy needed her completely. I listened to her, nodded, but inside, everything was seething with questions I couldn't articulate. I wanted to ask, were my early years not so crucial? Or did she simply have no choice but to be strong? She increasingly forgot to pack my lunch for school, and in the evening she'd be surprised. Oh, I'm sorry, honey, I was with Tommy all day. He had a doctor's appointment. This happened over and over again, until it became something of a familiar background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard saw everything. Sometimes I caught his gaze, worried, tired, as if he, too, didn't know how to help. One evening, as I sat at the table doing my homework, he came over, sat next to me, and quietly said, "Brittany, you know, sometimes people get so caught up in one thing that they don't notice how they're losing everything else." He helped me with my homework, but his words hung in the air like a candle's shadow. As Tommy grew older, the tension in the house became almost palpable. Mom became increasingly irritated when Richard tried to talk to her, and every discussion they had ended the same way, with shouting, slamming doors, and a silence that made my ears ring. It seemed to me that every day we were moving further and further away from each other, as if we were living in the same house, but on different islands. I remember that evening as if it were imprinted somewhere beneath my skin, like an old, scarred memory that can't be erased. Tommy was 5 then, frowning as he swiped mashed potatoes around his plate, drawing invisible lines in them. His mother sat across from him, leaning so close, as if she could force him to swallow even a single bite with the power of her gaze. "Come on, honey, just one more spoonful for mommy," she drawled. Her voice laced with more anxiety than patience, as if her very life depended on that one bite. Richard watched silently for a few minutes, then put down his fork and, gathering his courage, said calmly but firmly, "Sarah, we need to talk. You can't hang over him like this all the time. He needs to learn on his own, without your prompting, without your hand." I felt the air in the room thicken, become heavy, sticky. Mom's face changed instantly. All the softness, all the warmth she'd shown Tommy vanished in a second, and her eyes turned ice cold. "Are you saying I'm a bad mother?" Her voice trembled, not from pain, but from suppressed anger. "I didn't say that, Sarah," Richard replied calmly, trying not to raise his voice. "But you have two children here, not just one, and by the way, you also have a husband." I pretended to focus on my mashed potatoes, picking at them with my fork, as if there was some way to hide from the words flying across the table like arrows. "He's just a child." Mom turned to me, as if expecting me to agree, but I merely whispered something quietly under my breath, and no one even noticed. It was that very moment when I first realized that adult conversations could be more terrifying than a thunderstorm. Things reached a breaking point when Richard suggested signing Tommy up for Little League Baseball. I was sitting on the stairs, pretending to do my homework but hanging on every word coming from the kitchen. "Absolutely not." Mom's no was like a gunshot. "Are you crazy? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? He could get hit by a ball, twist his ankle, or, for God's sake, get hit in the head." Richard, without raising his voice, replied, "Sarah, he needs to learn to live, not just breathe, under your wing. You can't protect him from everything." But Mom wasn't listening anymore. A week later, she enrolled Tommy in art classes at the community center. I can still see his face, bored, tired, as if he knew this wasn't for him. He sat in front of a blank piece of paper, brushing his paints without any interest, while Mom, sitting to the side, looked at him as if she were seeing a great artist. He quit after 3 lessons, and Mom immediately found someone to blame, the teacher. "She simply didn't understand my son's creative nature," Mom said when they returned home, her voice tinged with pride, as if giving up drawing were proof of genius. Meanwhile, Richard spent more and more time with me. Perhaps it was his way of somehow balancing Mom's obsession, or perhaps he simply realized I had a child who needed attention. He drove me to karate 3 times a week, waited for me on the bench for every lesson, applauded louder than anyone when I received my new belt, and I, drenched in sweat and pride, saw his eyes light up with genuine joy. I blossomed under this attention, as if someone had noticed my existence for the first time in a long time. But while I was learning to be strong, Tommy was becoming increasingly difficult. His room looked like a hurricane had blown through it, toys, clothes, and books everywhere. Mom, looking at the chaos, would turn to me with that special look that wasn't a request, but a judgment. "Brittany, be a good sister and clean Tommy's room," she'd say in that tone that conveyed neither a question nor a choice. One day, Richard found out about this. He walked into the room just as I was picking up piles of cars from the floor and said sharply, "She's not his maid, Sarah." Mom, as always, flushed. "You love her more than your own son," she cried. And I saw Richard's face instantly go blank, as if the light had gone out. He looked at me, long, pained, apologetic, and quietly said, "Fine, have it your way." After that, he didn't argue with Mom anymore. He simply retreated, but the look he gave me that evening spoke louder than any words. He hadn't given up on me. Even if he had given up the fight, it was a tiny consolation, but sometimes it's those tiny things that make salvation possible. My high school graduation day always remained strangely bittersweet for me, as if the taste of freedom and loss mingled in my mouth, as if life was opening a door for me, only to see another, all too important one quietly closing behind me. I stood in the June sun, in my cap and gown, and saw the entire hall aglow with smiles, balloons, flowers, and parents' tears. Among them, I spotted Richard, standing a little apart, but his eyes gleaming with pride, as if this diploma were his own victory. My mother was nearby, but she kept looking at her phone, scrolling the screen with her finger, as if somewhere out there, in the soulless messages, there was something more important than this moment. I guessed. She was probably texting Tommy's nanny, checking if he'd remembered dinner, if he was tired, if he was sad. After the ceremony, Richard called me into his office. His voice was calm, but it held that special note he used only when it mattered. He pulled out a folder full of college brochures and placed it in front of me. "I've been saving my money, Brittany," he said, smiling. "You can choose any university you want. The world is open to you. You know no boundaries unless you set them." I couldn't respond right away. The shock took my breath away, but before I could find the words, my mother burst into the room, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You can't be serious, Richard," she blurted. "That money needs to be for Tommy's future. He'll need it more than ever." Silence hung between them, thick, taut, like a string. Richard's face hardened, and I recognized the expression I'd seen many times before, when he knew there was no point in arguing, yet still made up his mind. "It's not up for discussion, Sarah," he said firmly. "I've already made up my mind." And this time she didn't answer. She simply stood there, her lips pressed together, and then turned abruptly and walked away, leaving the scent of her perfume in the air, cold and prickly, like her resentment. I chose Marshall University in West Virginia, far enough away to feel independent for the first time, yet not so far away that the journey home seemed impossible. When Richard drove me to my dorm, we rode in silence almost the entire way. And only at the campus gates did he say, "You deserve this, Brittany, and please, don't look back. Sometimes, to survive, you have to leave." Mom didn't come. Tommy wasn't feeling well, she explained in a short message. I didn't answer. College life turned out to be something I hadn't even dared to dream of. For the first time in years, I could simply be myself, without expectations, without being the second child in someone else's endless drama. I woke up in the mornings with the feeling that the world was breathing in unison with me, that my own path lay ahead, not someone else's. I called home every week, but increasingly, the conversations were reduced to short exchanges with Richard. Mom was always too busy with Tommy. "He's going through a tough time," Richard would say, his voice weary, like someone who's been trying too hard to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. "He got involved with some kids, not the best crowd," he explained one evening. "I tried to interest him in something, suggested extracurricular programs, sports, volunteer work, but your mother—" "Let me guess," I interrupted, smiling bitterly. "She said you were too strict?" "Closer to the truth, she called me a tyrant," he sighed. "She said I didn't understand how sensitive Tommy was." Gradually, my visits home became less and less frequent. I dreaded returning to that atmosphere where everything revolved around one person, where my accomplishments paled in comparison to his fatigue or irritation. When I did arrive, Tommy barely noticed me. He'd sit for hours in his room, illuminated by the bluish glow of his screens, his fingers frantically tapping the buttons. The only sounds the gunshots and explosions of his games. Sometimes I'd knock on the door and say, "Hey, do you want me to make you something? Want to grab lunch with me?" But all I heard in response was the dry click of a keyboard and another digital explosion. My mother would pass by without looking at me, and, as if making excuses, she'd say, "He's just not in the mood, he's been really tense lately." I'd look at her and wonder how it was possible that the man who'd spent his whole life afraid his son would suffer pain now didn't notice how that pain had become a part of him. By the time I graduated from university and got a job in the consulting department of the Department of Economics, I was 23, and I decided to stay in West Virginia, to build a career, to finally build a life on my own terms. I watched from afar as Tommy retreated ever deeper into his own world, where real victories were replaced by virtual ones, where friends were avatars, and conversations with his mother were justifications. Richard tried to change things, but I could see in his eyes that he was tired. He still held on, still cared, but the struggle with my mother had drained him of the energy that had once been enough to save us both. When I turned 27, I increasingly realized that my brother and I were two different realities, raised under the same roof but in different worlds, me among real people and plans, he in the shadow of a computer screen, where life happened only on the screen, and my mother, still convinced she was protecting him, simply didn't notice how she was slowly losing him. I remember that day as clearly as if it were yesterday, the day I first turned the key in my own door, a small one-bedroom apartment, nothing special, just a neat little dwelling in a quiet neighborhood, but for me, it was like reaching the summit of a mountain I'd been climbing for years. Every time I'd turned down takeout coffee, every morning with a brown paper bag for lunch, every missed sale, it all suddenly made sense the moment the lock clicked and I stepped into that empty, yet future-filled space. I couldn't stop smiling. Even the air smelled different. Fresh, colorful, free, and a little bit fearful. When I called home that evening, my voice rang with joy. "You all should come see," I said. "I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner, Richard. I'll even make your favorite lasagna." And I heard him smile, that soft, slightly tired sound that always warmed my soul. "I wouldn't miss this for the world, baby," he replied, but before I could thank him, my mother's voice came on the other line, flat, icy, as if she were crossing something off a to-do list. "Oh, honey, I don't think we can make it. Tommy has plans for that day." I couldn't resist a hint of sarcasm. "Plans? What, Mom? A video game tournament?" But she only muttered something vaguely like "very important things." Tommy's familiar game thundered in the background, and everything became clear without words. On the day of the housewarming, only Richard arrived. He stood at the threshold, holding a potted plant and a bottle of wine, and when I opened the door, his face lit up, not with pity, not with regret, but with genuine pride. "Your mom says hi," he said, and we both knew it was a lie. I accepted the gift, placed the plant on the windowsill, and we sat at the table where my lasagna sat, smelling of garlic and childhood. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, and then, as if he couldn't bear it anymore, he said, "I have to tell you something, Brittany." I felt my heart clench. His voice was the same, but there was a weariness to it, heavy, viscous. "Tommy's 20 now. He doesn't think about college, doesn't think about anything at all except his games and the friends he drinks with in the evenings." I offered him a position at the company, something like an internship. "At least to start. Everyone has to start somewhere. You understand." "But Sarah," he paused, shook his head, and I finished for him, told him it was beneath him. He smiled sadly. "She's sure Tommy's too smart for physical work, too smart to work at all, but not smart enough to be a burden to his parents." I let out a quiet breath, unsure how to respond. We were silent for a long time, listening to the cars passing outside, the neighbor's dog barking somewhere below, and only then did he add, "I keep trying, Brittany, God knows, I keep trying." His eyes were reddish, but he was smiling, and that was the last time he spoke of hope. 2 years passed. That morning, the phone rang too early, and from the tremor in the voice on the other end, I knew immediately that something irreparable had happened. Richard had collapsed at work, his heart, like Dad's. By the time I got to the hospital, it was all over. I stood by his bed, surrounded by strange voices and machines that no longer helped, and I couldn't believe that history had repeated itself. That another person who had been a real support for me had left without saying goodbye. The funeral was like a strange, cold dream. Mom put on quite a show. She sobbed, clutched her heart, and repeated to everyone who came up, "He was such a wonderful husband, we were so happy, how will I live without him now?" I stood a little to the side and watched her cry, and I couldn't shake the thought that her tears weren't about Richard, they were about herself, the fear of being left without protection, without money, without the usual role of a woman who always has someone else to solve her problems. I saw the thoughts swirling behind that grief-stricken face, how she was already calculating how she would live now, how she would feed her unique son, how she would feed him, because Richard wasn't just a husband, he was the only one keeping this fragile construct called our family from collapsing. And Tommy didn't even try to look decent. He showed up in a rumpled polo shirt and old trousers, as if he were going to another game, and spent most of the service glued to his phone. I saw my mother, catching everyone's glances, whispering hastily, "He's just grieving in his own way, he feels it deeply," but I knew he simply didn't feel anything. Standing at Richard's grave, I watched the coffin being lowered into the ground and felt the past closing in on itself. Another father, another heart attack, another funeral. Only now I was an adult and saw everything clearly, how history was repeating itself, and how my mother's tears smelled not of pain, but of fear for her future. Because for her, Richard wasn't a person, but her last safety net, and now that, too, was gone. Almost a year had passed since Richard's death, and I found myself thinking less and less about the home that had once been mine. Mom and Tommy seemed to have vanished from my life. No letters, no visits, not even short messages. Occasionally, Aunt Linda would call, casually mentioning that they were living on the savings Richard left them, and her voice always sounded as if she herself didn't believe this situation would last. "Your mom sold his Chevy last month," she said one day. "The tools from his workshop were gone before that." I nodded, though she couldn't see it, and said something neutral like "I see," but inside I felt a heaviness, as if another piece of the past had been ripped out. I tried not to think about it, not to wallow in the endless guilt of not visiting, not calling, not being involved. I felt like I no longer had an obligation. But when my phone lit up with a familiar number on Tuesday evening, my heart, despite my better judgment, sank. Brittany, my mother's voice sounded different, weaker than I remembered. "Mom? Is everything okay? I need you to come home," she said quietly, and something in her tone, a barely perceptible tremor, made me hesitate to ask further questions. The next day, I was already on a plane. Clouds flashed past the window, and I tried to imagine what I would see when I returned, but even the darkest images in my imagination couldn't compare to reality. When I pulled up to the house, I thought I had the wrong address. The neat, well-kept house that Richard had once been proud of now looked abandoned. Grass grew above his knees, peeling paint was peeling off the frames, and one of the shutters was hanging on by one hinge, as if it was about to fall off. I knocked, and the door opened so slowly that my heart sank. Before me stood a woman I barely recognized as my mother. Her once well-groomed hair was pulled back into a messy bun, graying at the roots, and her face was lined, deep and bitter, like the cracks in an old porcelain doll. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Brittany, you've arrived." She turned, leading me into the house, and I stepped into a space where everything screamed neglect. The air was heavy, smelling of mold and stale air. The kitchen was piled high with dirty dishes covered in dried stains, and a gray layer of dust lay on the furniture. I couldn't believe I was standing in the same house where I'd once been forced to rewash dishes if there was even the tiniest drop of water left on them. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, settling myself onto the sofa, where a spring had popped out and dug into my thigh. It was the same sofa Richard had always promised to replace. She sat down opposite me, slumping heavily, as if her strength had deserted her. "Everything broke almost immediately," she began quietly, looking at the floor. "We're running out of money, Brittany. My pension barely covers the bills, and the savings," she hesitated, "the savings are almost gone." I clasped my hands in my lap. "What about Tommy? He's helping, right?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Mom's face froze, as if she hadn't expected the question. "He's looking for a job. It's not his fault. These employers, they just don't understand him." "They don't understand?" I couldn't help but say, irritation lacing my voice. "Mom, he's 26. So?" Her tone turned defensive. "Not everyone has to fit into your system. His intellect, his sensitivity." She trailed off, seeing my expression, and her tone wavered. "Brittany, please, we need your help. We can't do it without you." She folded her hands in her lap, like a girl afraid of punishment, and I suddenly felt pity, a sharp, agonizing feeling. "Despite everything, I feel bad asking," she continued, "but you're so well established. You have a career, a stable job. I was thinking maybe you could help with expenses until Tommy finds a suitable position." I knew what was coming, knew I'd given again, that the memories of Richard holding my hand at graduation would echo louder than reason. "How much do you need?" I asked quietly. She named a figure, $1,500 a month, and I almost choked. It was a significant portion of my salary, but I looked at her trembling hands, the tiredness in her eyes, and nodded. "Okay," I said, feeling my stomach clench. "Where's Tommy now?" I asked as I was about to leave, even though I already knew the answer. "He's interviewing," Mom said with obvious relief, as if she'd found a good excuse. "A very promising position, at a tech company." I walked to the window and saw the light from his bedroom reflected in the window, and the familiar flickering of the monitor, the same bluish glow that once accompanied the sounds of gunfire and screams from games. Some things, I thought, really do never change. The next day, I set up an automatic transfer, $1,500 a month, every 20th day. When the first transaction confirmation arrived, something inside me seemed to sink, but I still smiled to myself, bitterly and wearily, because I knew that Mom, as always, got what she deserved, and I, as always, had chosen not myself. Every month, when the withdrawal notification popped up on my phone, I caught myself thinking the same thing, that I was doing the right thing, that it was my duty, that maybe if I kept helping, things would somehow work out. Mom would recover, Tommy would come to his senses, and the house would feel like a home again, not a slowly rotting reminder that we once had a family. And yet, every time the money left my account, I felt a slight pang. Not in my wallet, but in my soul. It was like standing on the shore and watching coins fall into the water, one after another, and with each wave they sank deeper until you began to doubt whether any of them would ever return. I began visiting them more often, perhaps out of a sense of duty, perhaps out of guilt, but every time I stepped into that house, I felt like I was entering a time capsule, where nothing changed except the smell. It was now thick, heavy, saturated with age and stagnation. Tommy was still sitting in front of the screen, the light from the monitor casting a deathly glow on his face, his eyes red from lack of sleep, an open can of beer next to him, and I couldn't figure out when he'd changed so much, from a skinny boy who once dreamed of becoming an engineer to this listless man with a beer belly and a perpetual shadow of irritation on his face. "How's your job search going?" I asked one day, putting groceries on the table. "Don't meddle in my business," he muttered, not looking up from the screen. Sometimes he wouldn't even deign to answer me, he'd simply pick up the remote and turn up the volume. And Mom, sitting in her chair, pretended not to notice her son talking to me. "He's just tired," she defended herself. "You know it's tough for young people these days." At Christmas, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't bear to look at what the house had become. The wallpaper was peeling and billowing, a brown stain from a leaking pipe had spread across the ceiling, and dust lay thick even on the photographs, even though Richard had once wiped the frames every week, as if afraid the past would rust. I spent my entire Christmas bonus hiring contractors, and when I came back a week later, at least the ceiling had stopped crying. In February, Mom twisted her ankle, and I called to see how she was. "Oh, it's not that bad," she replied, but I could hear the pain in every breath. "Is Tommy helping you?" I asked. "He's busy," she said after a pause. "He has online interviews." I didn't believe a word of it, and the very next day I hired a caregiver, the same woman who'd looked after my neighbor after her stroke. All the money I'd saved for a vacation went toward her services for 3 weeks in advance. But the worst part was, I began to realize I was one of the few people even trying to keep this house afloat. And then that day happened. I arrived, as usual, with bags full of groceries, pushed the door open, and froze. On the couch, the same old couch where Richard once read the newspaper, sat a strange girl. Well, not just any girl, more like a character from a cheap reality show. Long false nails that could rip open a tin can, eyelashes that cast shadows down to her cheeks, and clothes, well, if you could call them clothes. Short shorts and a top that looked more like a bathing suit. She scrolled through her phone, surrounded by trash, empty cans, chip bags, plastic cups. I felt anxiety rising in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. Tommy emerged from the room with a triumphant air. "This is Candy," he said, placing his hand on her shoulder, "my fiancée. She lives here now." Candy didn't even look at me, simply loudly popped her gum and leisurely reached for the grocery bag I'd just brought in. She pulled out a box of cookies, the very ones I'd bought for Mom, and opened it without asking. "Nice to meet you," she muttered, not looking up. I stood there with the bags in my hands, feeling a wave of indignation, fatigue, and despair rising inside me, but I said nothing. I just nodded and went into the kitchen, where the sink was already overflowing with dirty dishes. Later that evening, I called my mom. Mom, did you know Tommy has someone staying at his place? I asked. Oh, Brittany, she replied, her voice suddenly brightening. Isn't it wonderful? Tommy's finally settled down. Candy's such a good influence on him, he hasn't gone out drinking with those awful friends in weeks. I rolled my eyes but said nothing. That's because she drinks all the beer at home, I thought, remembering the empty bottles in the recycling bin. Mom continued, as if she hadn't heard my silence. And by the way, he's talking about work. Candy's cousin knows someone at a tech startup. It could be his big break. I made a non-committal sound, not a laugh, not an approval, just to avoid arguing. I'd heard about dozens of such breakthroughs over the years. And none of them had led to anything real. My next visit was a couple of weeks later. I was juggling bags as usual, pushed the door open, and froze. The house looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Dirty dishes filled not only the sink but the table as well, food containers littered the floor, and clothes, women's, men's, it was hard to tell whose, were scattered all over the living room. It smelled like a mixture of sweat, cheap perfume, and stale beer. And at that moment, I realized that the money I'd been sending month after month wasn't drowning in need, but in a swamp of habits, self-deception, and laziness. And maybe the worst part wasn't that I realized it, it was that I still knew. Next week I'd transfer that $1,500 again. Candy lay there like she owned the couch, her legs stretched out on it, as if it had belonged to her since birth. A phone in a pink glitter case lay on her lap, her nails, long, sparkling, artificial, tapping out the rhythm of some alien life on the screen, and the sound was giving me a headache. She didn't even look up when I walked in, setting down the grocery bags I'd bought with my own money on the kitchen table. I stood there, looking at her, feeling that same feeling growing inside me, not anger, but weariness, laced with resentment. You know, Candy, my voice sounded unexpectedly sharper than I'd intended. You live here, eat the food I pay for, use everything I pay for. The least you could do is wash a couple of dishes. She slowly looked up, a smirk played on her lips, and the glitter on her lipstick shimmered in the dim light like tiny shards of something fake. Who are you to come here and give orders? She drawled, stretching lazily. This isn't your house, baby. I felt my heart pound in my chest. I grew up here, I replied sharply. This is my house, just like it was Mom's, and you're just a guest, nothing more. She laughed. It was a sharp, loud, triumphant laugh, and it sent shivers down my spine. Oh, darling, you've got it all wrong, she said, holding out her phone as if displaying a trophy. This house belongs to Tommy now. Your mom signed everything over to him, there's a will. I didn't believe it. I thought she was lying, just trying to hurt me, but my chest still felt cold. I rushed to the kitchen, where Mom, hunched over the table, was sorting through a stack of old newspapers, cutting out coupons I knew she'd never use. Mom, my voice wavered, is this true? Did you make a will and leave everything to Tommy? She didn't look up, she was shuffling through some papers, as if trying to hide behind them. Yes, she finally said, and her voice was firm. Alien, it's true. But why? I could barely hear myself. I help you, Mom, I send you money every month, pay for the nurse, the repairs, the groceries. Tommy doesn't do anything, he doesn't even look for a job. Don't you dare talk about your brother like that. She suddenly raised her voice, and that steely note that had made me shudder as a child crept into it. You don't understand him, you never understood him. I felt my teeth clench. I don't understand? Mom, he's a parasite, he lives off my money while his girlfriend destroys your house. Stop being so dramatic, she interrupted, waving me away as if she were an annoying fly, and then her face suddenly changed, something venomous, twisted, as if all those years of pent-up irritation and preferences had burst forth. Do you want to know the truth? Her eyes flashed. I've never loved you the way I love Tommy, he's better than you in everything that matters, and I don't want to see you here anymore. The world seemed to crumble. These words weren't just insults, they were blows, precise, calculated, as if she'd been holding them in reserve for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood before her, feeling everything inside me go empty, For so many years, I'd convinced myself that her love was simply different, that it manifested itself in its own way, that its coldness was a defense, that underneath it all there was tenderness, just hidden deep, but now I knew, no, there was no tenderness. I turned and walked toward the door. Candy's loud chuckle rang out behind me, that same laugh, with a hint of triumph, as if she'd won some long ago bet I'd never even heard of. That laughter followed me down the hallway until I slammed the door behind me. 21 years, that's how long I'd lived, hoping to earn my mother's love, searching for even a crumb of warmth in her cold words, attributing everything to her fatigue, her concern for Tommy, her fears, and then it all ended with the soft click of the lock. The drive home was a blur. I drove along the highway, oblivious to the scenery, my hands numb on the wheel, for hours of driving vanished in the blink of an eye. I didn't remember parking the car, climbing the stairs, or opening the door to my apartment, but I do remember the moment I sat down on the couch, turned on the lamp, and stared at the phone screen, where my own gaze was reflected, tired, but finally clear. A familiar icon blinked on the screen, an automatic transfer of $1,500 to Mom's account, set up over a year ago. I stared at it for a long moment, my finger hovered over the screen. I thought about her words, about Tommy, about Candy, about how I tried again and again to be needed, how I bought their appreciation, and then I simply clicked cancel recurring payment. Click, small, quiet, almost insignificant, but the sound was louder than any scream. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work like a lifeline, taking on projects I'd previously refused, staying late at the office. I tried not to think, but I still caught myself thinking about the strange freedom I now possessed. The hole in my budget that I'd previously felt like a burden suddenly became an opportunity. I opened a new account and started looking for ways to invest, thinking about my own needs instead of others for the first time in years, maybe, for the first time in all this time. I could start saving for a home, a real, warm home, mine. And exactly a month to the day after I closed my mother's door behind me and, for the first time in a long time, felt a silence that didn't oppress but breathed freedom, the phone rang. On the screen, Mom. I stared at that word for a long time, at those 4 letters, as if they were foreign, as if I were seeing them for the first time. I finally answered, more out of curiosity than a sense of duty. The money didn't arrive, she said immediately, without a greeting, without a pause, without feigned warmth, with that same dry irritation I'd grown up with. There must have been some kind of mistake at the bank. No mistake, I replied, and I was surprised at myself. My voice was even, calm, almost indifferent. I canceled the transfers. There was silence, that same thick, viscous silence when even breathing becomes a sound, and then, an explosion. How dare you, she screamed, and I almost saw her face tighten, her lips tremble. After everything I've done for you. I laughed softly, and it was probably the first real laugh I'd had in years. After everything you've done for me? I repeated, remind me, Mom, what exactly? Maybe after you made me babysit Tommy for years? Or after she said she never loved me? That's different, she screamed, and her voice echoed that old, painfully familiar refrain, justification, accusation, defense of Tommy. You know, I was upset. But you can't just stop helping us. We're counting on that money. Tommy and Candy are planning a vacation for Christmas, they need a break. From what, Mom? I asked quietly, from video games and beer? How dare you talk about your brother like that, she howled, you're just jealous. Jealous? I couldn't help but chuckle. From what, Mom? That he got everything? That you signed the house over to him? That he doesn't work and lives off someone else? Yes, maybe I really am jealous, not of his idleness, but of how easy it is for him to be loved. There was a pause on the other end, then the torrent began again, incoherent, furious, full of accusations and distorted memories. She said I was ungrateful, selfish, that Tommy was always there, and I only took. It was strange to listen to, like someone playing an old recording from childhood, but now I heard it with different ears. I let her rage for a while, and then simply said, goodbye, Mom, don't call me anymore. And before she could answer, I hit block contact. But Mom didn't give in. Over the next few weeks, the real onslaught began. First, the Facebook messages, long posts about how hard it was for her to pay the bills, about what a terrible daughter I was, about her broken heart, then the comments under my photos, passive-aggressive, but understandable. The emails were confessions of her sacrifices, of how she always put me first. I couldn't even remember most of them, because they never happened. Tommy, of course, didn't stand idly by. He wrote a couple of messages, aggressive, resentful, and full of ultimatums. "Mom is crying because of you," he wrote. "You have to start helping again, otherwise." I didn't finish reading, I only responded, "Here's a crazy idea, Tommy, try getting a job." And I blocked him, too. And then Candy showed up, yes, Candy, on LinkedIn, of all places, a huge message, full of pompous words and false pity, about how I'd broke my poor mother's heart, how Tommy was too sensitive to handle the stress of work, and how I have always been cold and cruel. I reread it, smiled, and even felt a kind of respect for her persistence, pure manipulation, almost professionally executed. 6 months have passed, no calls, no letters, no messages. Sometimes, scrolling through my feed, I accidentally stumble upon their old photos, and I feel nothing, no pain, no guilt, no anger, just silence, and this new feeling turned out to be so sweet. No guilt, no anger, just silence, and this new feeling was so sweet. Maybe they're still waiting for me to give in, maybe they've found someone else to become their new cash cow, or maybe Tommy finally got a job, though I don't believe it. The truth is, I don't need to know anymore, I don't have to know. The $1,500 that used to drain monthly into the black hole of their constant need has become a down payment on my own house, small, modest, but mine, with its own walls, silence, and the smell of coffee in the morning. I sleep better than ever, no more late-night accusatory calls, no more texts hinting at guilt, just me, my breathing, and peace. Sometimes I think about Richard. I imagine how he would smile if he knew I'd finally stood up for myself, that I'd escaped the sticky web of debt and guilt that had held me captive my entire life. He'd say, "Finally, Brittany, you deserve to live for yourself." The other day, I was driving past a construction site, the noise, the smell of dust, the workers' voices, and amid it all, a sign hung, "Employees wanted, no experience necessary." I stopped for a moment, pulled out my phone, almost took a picture to send to Tommy, just out of habit, and then I smiled, put the phone away, and drove on. Because their lives are no longer mine, their choices are no longer mine, their troubles are no longer mine. And in that, silence, space, light, in that, freedom, finally,